The passing of the Reverend and social justice activist Jesse Jackson represents a watershed moment in American history. At a time when progressives and moderates in the Democratic Party seem to be struggling to find their voice and political identity in the age of President Donald Trump's Make America Great Again movement in his second term, Democrats would do well to remember Mr. Jackson's example of creating a patchwork quilt of humanity in which every member of American society, regardless of race, class, or gender, would be woven into a cohesive political movement not seen since President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal agenda of the 1930s. Back in the late 1980s, however, when Jesse Jackson first declared his intent to seek the Democratic presidential nomination in 1984 and 1988, he had virtually no support from the black community leadership and functioned largely as a progressive and social justice insurgent in a Democratic Party that was wrought by deep ideological differences between its largely Southern conservative wing, its Midwestern moderate wing, and its East Coast progressive liberal wing. Then, as now, the Democratic Party faced the question of what it stood for in the face of an ever increasing conservative populist agenda that was championed by one of America's most conservative presidents, Ronald Reagan. Jackson's solution to the Reagan administration's conservative and economic social agenda, which was built upon rolling back economic and social protections for the poor, was to move the Democratic Party to a base of economic pragmatism that would encompass, as he called it, a rainbow coalition of white working class voters, American social justice advocates, Arab American voters, members of the LGBTQ community, and other elements of America's socially and economic downtrodden into the mainstream of American politics that would include the power using the power of government to better the lives of working people. Jackson's political agenda thus had less to do with an ideological emphasis on certain programs or ideological stances on controversial issues, and more to do with championing economic and social justice causes that would gain traction across a diverse chunk of American voters. One predominant tactic of Jesse Jackson's first primary campaign in 1984 was to meet with a group of white working class farmers in Iowa, in which he stood in solidarity with them to point out that they were being exploited by the same corporate and profiteering forces that were exploiting members of the African American community. Likewise, in his 1988 campaign, Jackson was one of the first candidates in the Democratic Party to speak to the needs of members of the LGBTQ community, who, during the age of AIDS, had not yet been approached or successfully courted as a core constituency of one of the two major parties. Jackson, however, viewed the plight of gay Americans as equal to that of the economic plight of the white working class farmers he spoke out for in Iowa, as well as members of the black community who were denied access to the economic mainstream of American life because of a lack of job training programs and the cutting of social welfare services by the Reagan administration. Jackson was thus able to bring attention to the AIDS crisis, forced the Democratic Party in 1988 to adopt a more progressive platform in combating and speaking to the crisis of AIDS, and make as the centerpiece of his campaign a more progressive rainbow coalition within the Democratic Party that would be more responsive to the economic and social needs of people of color. After a crushing defeat in the 1988 presidential election, in which the Democratic nominee, Michael Dukakis, was soundly defeated by Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, The Democratic Party, in nominating Bill Clinton in 1992, would be forced to adopt some of Jackson's progressive reforms, including Clinton's plan for national health care and an assault weapons ban. The Clinton presidency would present for Jackson and other progressive members of the party, however, a challenging time in American political history when it came to navigating the rise of a conservative backlash in Congress led by the Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Clinton, post 1994, out of political necessity, would be forced to compromise with many of the measures of the Republican Congress, including in signing the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act, the 1994 Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, which prohibited openly gay members of the military from serving in uniform, though it would eventually be repealed in 2011, and seeing the death of the cause of national health care in 1993. Jackson nonetheless saw these setbacks as necessary building blocks to a road of full equality, to the final knitting, if you will, of all the different patches of humanity woven into one unified quilt. Jackson's efforts in the 1980s and his work to elect President Bill Clinton in the 1990s did come with several small but substantial victories, at least from within the electoral infrastructure of the Democratic Party. For example, by the time of the Democratic Convention in 1992, delegates would no longer be selected on a winner take all basis. Rather, they would be proportionately allocated to any candidate who won over 15% of the vote in a state primary or caucus. Such an achievement would prove crucial to the nomination primary victories of President Barack Obama in 2008, when Obama, a long shot candidate from Illinois with a relatively small and unknown record in the U.S. Senate, would go on to win the Democratic presidential nomination and 2 terms in the White House. At a time when Republicans, and specifically President Donald Trump, are, for the first time, vulnerable on the issue of the economy, the Democratic Party would do well to remember the example set by Reverend Jesse Jackson, in which he chose not to focus on defining any particular set of ideological principles, but rather to focus on championing social and economic causes that could speak to the needs of every American. For Jackson inspired in the hearts of all Americans his principle of keeping hope alive. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, when Democrats, and indeed all Americans, regardless of party, move to keep hope alive, the nation can get closer to living up to its highest potential and for a period in history that will last longer than just beyond the next election cycle. But I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with my general assessment of Jesse Jackson's impact on shaping the modern contours of the Democratic Party? And do you think American politics today would be more or less divided if all members in both parties would focus on keeping hope alive as it relates to combating poverty and achieving full equality for every American? Let me know in the comments, and thank you very much for watching.